fantastic introduction, Tom. And I always like to introduce myself, especially when these kind of discussions with a story myself. So I actually am going to kick this off with just a little story about kind of my progression in moving towards agility, because it's been an area, as Tom alluded to, I've been around for the last decade or so, really getting deep into. And really, the first experience I had, and actually even knowing what Agile or any sort of aspect around Scrum kind of came around with, was back in 2009. It was right actually I was graduating from university, and I was getting ready to leave the university, and I had a friend of mine who had just previously left, and he took a new job where he actually happened to have joined, in this case, a Scrum team. And this was actually a Facebook message he sent me. It was June 2009. I hadn't started my job yet, but he had sent me this, and he says, "Hey, Mark, it's great to see you. We had this little thing going on about, in terms of how we referred to each other." And so one of the things here that really, at the time, I didn't catch it until after the point. And he said this, "Hey, they're also, in terms of his new group, they're doing this type of development process, and he's been really interested in trying. It's called Scrum. Basically you work in the same area with your whole team, you work on getting things done." He says for someone new like himself, it was really valuable because, he could learn from the people around him. And so this was like, I saw this message. I was like, cool, he made it, he made it to his place he's going. But it's like, I'd never heard about Scrum before. Like, what is this thing? And I kind of just kept going on with my life. I had a new job. I was getting ready to join. And, about a month and a half later, I joined that role. And I remember my very first day of that job, I walked in, traditional, it was a big corporate building. Walked into the building, met my mentor at the front door, and he said, "All right, welcome, Mark. I'm going to take you to where the team sits." I'm like, "Okay, cool." So we're kind of walking through. I'm not really thinking about much, and he says, "All right, here's the team area." I'm like, "Whoa, this is kind of neat. Big old whiteboards all over the wall, big post-it paper. There's a big table in the middle where the team is all gathered around and they're sitting doing their work. And then as we're starting to approach, all of a sudden people start getting up, and my mentor kind of leans in and says, "All right, Mark, it's time for our daily Scrum. Let's get up and we're going to go check it out." And that was my very first daily Scrum. And we actually, after that was over, I spent the rest of the day talking with my mentor about what Agile was, what Scrum was, how they're practicing it. And over the next 6 months in this job, I had the opportunity to really experience what I would consider was probably one of the most high-performing teams I've ever worked with. And this is my very first job. We were a team that we shipped product every 2 weeks. Talk about collaboration. We could sense what each other needed. It was a really cool experience for us, and so I really cherished that 6 months. Now, the job I'd taken was actually one where I would rotate through different jobs. And so this was only my first rotation. So as I finished up that first rotation, it was time to say goodbye and actually move on to the next role. So you can imagine me, I'm all souped up. I'm like, this is great. I love college. I'm in this super collaborative environment. I love this. And I'm like, I can't wait for the next gig. And so the next gig I have, I'm going to be a project manager in this case. And so I was, okay, I don't know what that is at the time, but let's do it. And so I first day of that new rotation, I went and I meet my new manager. And I says, "All right, hey, how you doing?" And he says, let me go take you to where you're going to sit. It's cool, and I'm all full of energy. I'm ready to go. We're walking through this lane of cubicles, and he says, "All right, Mark, here's your seat." And I was like, "Oh, okay, it's a little different from the last place." And so I'm kind of looking around, and a lot of empty cubes around me. I'm like, "Where's my team sit?" And he says, "Well, most of the team is upstairs on the second floor. The other half is over in building C across the way. You won't need to meet with them very often. Don't worry about that." And I'm like, okay, that's just a little different from what I had experienced. But I'm young, I'm eager. Let's give this a shot. And come to find out, I'm in the middle half of what we would look at as a 18-month project. So I'm in months 7 through 12 essentially, and we're just getting into development. We probably won't actually leave development before I'm done. And I spent the first couple weeks just trying to understand where things are at. And after those first few weeks, I decided, this is, we're not getting any value out. We're not seeing our product. And I was like, maybe I could talk to my manager about this. So I get my manager and I talk to him and I says, hey, in my last role, I did this thing called Scrum, and I'm still pretty new to it, but I was like, I did this thing called Scrum. We got to see value every now and then. It was great. And he says, do you think we could maybe try something like that here? And he looks at me and he goes, Mark, we don't do that agile thing here. And to this day, I look at that 6 months I spent in that group as that project manager as probably the most valuable 6 months of my entire career. And the reason is because it really truly established a personal mission for me. I never wanted to experience that again, where we felt this lack of value, this lack of camaraderie. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to turn my career into this. I want to do everything in my power to create and break down barriers to collaboration and really build environments that value things like agility, autonomy, and feedback. That is what I want to make my career about. And that's what I've been doing. So as Tom alluded to, I've spent my career across a number of different industries. I've been a Scrum Master, a product owner, developer, release train engineer, a coach, and even just most recently, I'm now working for Atlassian. And in my current role as an enterprise solutions architect, where I'm helping organizations really try to connect the dots together using a product called Jira Line. And so that's me. That's who I like to, again, I like to do that little introduction for, so you can get to know me a little bit more and kind of my story. So I'm excited for what we're going to be doing today. Just to kind of give you a little bit of a precursor here. So the rest of today's session is going to be focused in and around storytelling, as you can imagine, but we're taking a slightly different spin. With this kind of presentation, I've done it a number of times, and it's usually a very standard presentation, but Mohammed challenged me to say, hey, can we make this more conversational? And I really like that, because I think that's where stories come in. And so we're going to turn this into something more conversational. I'm going to have some parts that I speak at, and I'm going to talk to you about some aspects of storytelling, but him and I are going to banter back and forth. I would love to have your banter in here as well, so please join in as we get in here. So let's actually, what was that, Mohammed?
I look forward to that, Mark. Looking forward.
I know, right? We're going to have some good times here. I know we will.
Absolutely.
So Mohammed, I was telling Mohammed about this in terms of storytelling. It's like, I always like to have people like kind of stretch that storytelling muscle right off the bat. And so I run this sort of activity at the beginning, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to give it a shot here. And so what we do is I have a little icebreaker I like to run at these things. It's called details. And if you think about it, details are everything when it comes to storytelling. Little things make or break our understanding of stories. And it's just the right amount of details when applied can actually help them really resonate with us. So we're going to run this activity, and typically if I'm in person, we have people pair up and we do this. But what I'm actually going to do in a virtual setting is I'm actually going to look for 2 volunteers. So I'd like to get 2 people who'd like to volunteer to be storytellers. All you're going to have to do is tell us, each of you just have to tell us a small little story. One will have to tell us the process of putting on your shoes in the morning. The other person will tell us the process of putting on your coat. So pretty easy, right? So is there anyone who'd like to volunteer for this? Again, remember those prizes at the end. I'm going to be looking at my volunteers.
Sure, I'll go for it.
Who was that? We've got
Douglas.
Awesome. I've got Douglas down. All right, Douglas, we'll have you do the shoes. I need one more.
I can do that as well.
Krishna, is that you?
Yeah, Krishna, sorry.
Awesome. No, you're good. So Douglas and Krishna. So Douglas, you're going to be the storyteller that describes the process of putting on your shoes. Krishna, you'll be the storyteller who describes the process of putting on your coat. So I've got a couple caveats here, and you'll kind of see that in the rules section here on the screen. Storytellers, so Krishna and Douglas, you guys will actually have to fill 2 minutes talking about that small mundane process. So again, details will matter. You'll spend 2 minutes. I'm going to be timing us on my phone, and I will tell you when to stop. You better still be going when I tell you to stop. And then for the rest of us, we're all going to be listeners in this. And what I'm inviting you to do is close your eyes and really try to picture what Krishna and Douglas are kind of talking through here. Sound good, everybody?
Sounds good, Mark.
That's good.
All right.
Good.
All right. So Douglas, you're our first one up. Let me get my timer on the phone going. And so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and do 2 minutes. And again, Douglas, if you can, tell us, describe the process of you putting on your shoes.
Okay.
Go.
So first, I'll go out into the front door in the hallway to find my shoes. Hopefully, they're both there. So I look down. I'll basically pick up the left shoe first, and then slip my foot into it. Pull back on the heel to make sure I can get the full foot in there, and then push down till it's nice and snug. And then, yeah, I guess I'll bend down, take hold of both the laces, pull them tight, and then, okay, so I guess I have to describe this. It's yep, get the laces, put one over the top of the other one, pull that together, and then slip one under, pull that so you've got the basic first knot. Pull over one of the laces to make a loop, and then wrap the other lace around it to pull through, and then pull that tight, and then that should be the left shoe on. And then reach down, take the right shoe, pick that up, slip my foot into that, put my foot back onto the floor, pulling around the heel, just basically to get my heel in, pushing down to make sure my foot is in fully, and then basically take hold of both laces, pull them so they're so that it's tight, and then yep, basically put one of the laces in, just slip it over to the other side, and same with the other lace, and then pull them, wrap one onto the other one, pull that tight so it's made the first crossover, and then basically make a loop with my left hand.
It's been 2 minutes. Nice work, Douglas.
That went faster than expected.
You got through it. Give a round of applause, guys. Well done, right? You're like, when will it stop? When will it stop?
I thought I had way more time there, Carl.
All right, so Krishna, you kind of got to see what we got going on here. So you, my friend, have the opportunity to describe to us the process of putting on your coat, and your time starts now.
Yeah, I'll try to do 2 minutes. I doubt it. First, I go down the stairs, check through the window, check the weather, how the weather is, whether it's rainy or sunny. And if it is rainy, I'll to go and I'll try to pick up a rainy coat. First, I'll check whether the hood is on or hood is not there. I'll pick the coat with the hood on it. I'll put on the coat. I'll put right sleeve on first, and then put the left sleeve, and put on the coat, and put my hood back on, put on the buttons, and I'll just walk into the rain and see whether it's working or not. And if it is not working, come back and try to find a bit a wintry coat or something. And if I have to change it, I'll change it, and based on the weather outside. And then I'll put on a different coat again, and make sure all the buttons are tied up and the coat is in good condition to use. And then, to be honest, I can't say anything else.
Keep on going. You still got 45 seconds.
45 seconds, that's great. Yeah, then if the coat, make sure the coat is tight enough and it suits my size or not. And if it is not, try to make sure find another coat which is the right size for me. And then if it is right, put the right sleeve again on, put the right one and the left sleeve on. Then put all the buttons on. Then make sure there's nothing left open or anything like that, and then try to go on the street and make sure
All
if
right,
it
that's
is.
2 minutes. I won't make you go any longer.
Sorry, it's really
Nice work.
talk.
No, give him a round of applause, guys. Nice work.
How many coats did you
So-
put on, Krishna?
He's walking around like this now. He's like, I got them all.
Yeah.
Great effort, Krishna.
Yeah, I never should have put my hand up there.
Yeah, well,
thank you,
volunteered. Thank you for volunteering.
So this is an
Douglas.
interesting one. So Krishna and Douglas, I'd love to get your perception here. So how was that? I mean, you think about it. You're putting on a coat. You're putting on your shoes. I mean, describe for us a little bit about like how that felt trying to fill 2 minutes.
Well, I thought I dragged it out quite well, to be honest. Enough
You
so
did.
that
You got both
Yeah, you
shoes,
did
you
really
know.
well.
yeah, I didn't quite get to tie the laces on the other foot, so that would have annoyed me when I walked out the door. But as far as that went, I guess I was just trying to think of enough detail to put in to drag out 2 minutes. So that was the main part. I probably could have done it maybe in 45 seconds, maybe, if I hadn't have done that. But seems I went overtime, so yeah, not quite within that.
I will say, Douglas, I'm going to give you the cake here in this one. You're the first person I've ever had do this exercise. I've done this dozens of times that have this says like I could use some more time. I love it.
Clearly, I take too long to put my shoes on.
Yeah, for me, being a business analyst from a long time, I like to be a bit more concise and more understandable. And timeline is kind of, more kind of on your back of your brain. You're thinking you need to fill up your time than actually adding any value there for me. So that's one of the points I thought. I think you need to be a bit more precise to the point what the requirements needed for the developers or anything need to be done. And that should be short and sweet enough. That's how I thought. But anyway, because it is kind of a task for me to do for 2 minutes, so I was trying to drag it back and back again.
I love it. No, you guys did great. Now, so that's great. So that was something for you guys. Is probably, again, it was something both kind of difficult, but you had to try to make it through. The question that's most important here that I find is, I'd love to hear from the audience now, is for the rest of you who had to I invited you to close your eyes. I invited you to, just listen. I mean, were you able to, again, to visualize what Krishna and what Douglas were doing? Were you able to kind of see that in your mind's eye? Describe that for me.
Yes, actually, I put myself in the position which the person described. So actually, I walk through that process by myself, and actually, even see the rug. There was no even mention about the, having little door and the rug and the front and all the surroundings start appearing. Not only what actually been said,
you start seeing it all around you, right?
Yes.
You're like, whoa.
Yeah, exactly. It's my vivid imagination, maybe, but
that's fantastic. I love that. Other thoughts that are out there?
Yeah,
Mohammed, how about you? What were your thoughts, Mohammed? As you kind of, you and I, we talked about this, but we never went through. I mean, what did you observe as you were going through and just kind of listening to these guys?
Yeah, I mean, I thought Krishna was hilarious because I was trying to count how many times he walked out the door and the number of coats he put on and the number of buttons on that coat. And what was really interesting is the words that were coming on. It was like, how many buttons are on this coat? I'm like, how many coats has he put on? And it made, I could feel that he was filling it in. Obviously, it's part of the game and the exercise, but I was counting the quotes, and I think he put on about 3 or 4 in my view. But I was, I found it interesting, but what I saw, there was no emotion behind it. That's what I felt, and I thought
that'll be an interesting thing we'll get to here later today too. Is where's how do you inject the emotion in, right?
Indeed, and I also want just a quick point on the point that
go for it.
Powell made. I hope I said that right. The visualization that was created in his mind's eye, if you like, was his own, and I think that's an important observation to take forward.
Mm-hmm.
Because what the storyteller or what Douglas and Krishna were trying to do, they painted a picture, but I think a much larger picture was built around the receiver's end.
Mhm.
maybe
And one
that's
thing we're going to talk about.
But
Oh,
that you
go
always,
for it.
I was going to say, I think you build the experience, you build the
Mm.
picture based on your own
on your experience,
experiences.
yeah.
Mhm.
And for me, when I was thinking of putting the coat on, I had an image of a really messy hallway with hundreds of coats.
Right. Which one am I going to grab?
Yeah, which is not how my life is at all. But I had this image of this place with loads of coats and loads of shoes all over the floor, and a mess. I also was very grateful I'm female and don't have to bother with all of that shoey bit. It's just straight in and out.
But you have to decide which pair to put on, probably.
That
It's
is true, yeah.
stereotyping.
True. It may take just equally as much
you
time.
have to look at your outfit first and decide.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, I think the choice of shoes would have
Shoes.
been much
The-
bigger at the beginning
longer.
of that.
I'll
I
tell you
think
what I
John
really
was going to
like.
say something as well. John, did you want to add something?
Yeah, it was just I was just intrigued. He does his left foot completely finished, and then he moves to his right foot, or vice versa. And but like Alison and Sarah, I was envisioning my own hallway, and unfortunately, my hallway does look that mess, and it does have shoes and scooters and trainers and wellies and all these other things. And also I have the added danger of, actually, if I pull my coat too far or too hard, the actual rack comes down and falls on you. But likewise, as with Alison and Sarah, I actually have slip-on shoes. So this whole idea of tying these knots and one after the other, it's like I would really struggle.
Like, what
spend
is that?
2 minutes, and it's like, oh, it's like putting slippers on. That's it. They're on. Yeah,
It's amazing the type of
very, very
details you
well
might
done.
reveal through that kind of stuff, right? It's like knowing your audience in that case. You know, as you look at that, and you feel like, let's say your audience, everyone who does slip-on shoes, it's like, oh crap, I've got to be able to speak. I've got to add potentially different details that they may be able to relate to.
Yeah, indeed.
Fascinating. Well, I love this. I love the banter so far, folks. This is perfect, because I think this is where it gets interesting as we look at storytelling. The goal here is to help paint that picture, and that's kind of what we're going to be learning about. So a couple of things that, as we think about what we're going to be doing here today is, to me, you came here because you looked at a description and it says we want to add storytelling to our agile coaching toolbox. Like that's why we came here. That's why we looked at that thing. The interesting thing, though, is as I kind of started personally going down this storytelling journey, I about 4 years ago, I started looking into this because I was like, I just want to put I want to use this as a tool, and I want to become a storyteller. And then I kind of realized something. I was going through this, and I was like, there's this kind of epiphany I had. And it was funny. Someone brought up in the breakout room this exact point here that I kind of came to myself. We're already storytelling superheroes as humans. So just think about it. We started out today's session going into breakouts talking about stories. We were telling stories about the stories we tell and the power they have. We just got through talking a little bit we did some storytelling about, hey, yeah, for me, my story revolves around the use of slip-on shoes or the clutter in my hallway. We communicate through story in everything we do. And so for me, the session is not about putting storytelling in our toolbox, but instead it's more focused on refining the skill. We want to sharpen our storytelling skills. We're already doing it, but how can we get better? The analogy I like to use here is anybody can pick up a guitar and maybe strum a couple chords, but to create real music, that's a skill in and of itself that has to get sharpened. And so Mohammed and I were kind of talking about this, and we said, well, so what is a story? And I think many of you kind of talked about this too, but Mohammed, I'll kind of kick it off with you. I mean, for you, what's a story in your mind?
I think for me, maybe I first say, I think that the discussion that Mark and I had was we wanted to draw a strict distinction in this particular session around a user story and a story, right? Just to say that perhaps for me, in our world, we use user stories as a concept to define a piece of work that we want to perhaps do. And certainly that has a narrative format in its own right. But for me, really a story, if you look at it in the broader sense, it's more about being able to take people on a journey. That's the first criteria. And then it's about saying, well, like we experienced earlier on with Douglas and Krishna. And then it's about saying, well, how engaged were we in that story? So I think for me, those two key factors are really, really important.
It's really interesting because as you think about stories in general, you're right in that there are different types of stories. And a lot of times when we think of stories, we think of user stories. And I do love what user stories have done. The only thing I always worry about too with user stories is that we get into the same mode that maybe we have gotten burned by in the past, is that we're very like prescriptive in terms of the story, in terms like a user story brought up. Like you say, all right, here who, the how, and the why, or who, the what, and the why, as we think about it. And that's where they always have to be. And to me, when I think about a story, it's like, well, no, a story has to have meaning to it. It has to have, to your point, it's got to have a journey to it. I think Aristotle actually talked about stories that had, he was the first big epiphany out there about stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And everyone was astonished when he said that. That's what a story is to me. And I get worried sometimes that user stories kind of hold us back at some levels. I don't know. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, there's absolutely room from if you talk about user stories from a persona perspective, from a user perspective. I really like the idea of user stories because, we moved away from the idea that we wanted to develop software and do everything and anything for everybody, and get more specific about how are we meeting needs of people. What is their life story? What is it that our story and our journey is going to help them fulfill, right? So I love the key components, and I quite agree with you in the idea that we shouldn't be wedded to that, but we should be wedded to the idea that we should identify who's the beneficiary of this work, whether it's a storytelling session on a stage, or whether it's doing whatever it is that we do in our daily life, who's benefiting from it.
You gotta keep the outcome in mind, right?
Absolutely.
What's the ultimate place we want to get to? And I think that's one of the things. If I get a lot of stories that are saying, as a system, I want to do this. Like you and I were even joking about that. Where's the story in that? What's the journey of that system? And maybe that's a legitimate thing, but I want you to tell me a story.
Absolutely, and I think the as a system issue is, I don't know how many of you else in the room sort of find yourselves geared towards possibly or forced to writing stories in that format where you have as a system. Nobody ever asked the system what they wanted, right? And then that's a really important point. So how do you sort of do things from a user story perspective? So if we widen it, user stories are a great technique that help people engage in why we do what we do, and then get into the how of delivering it.
Yep, I totally agree. I think going back to kind of what you talked about at the very beginning, there is this idea of defining a story. And to me, I tend to agree with you that a story is all about a journey. And I even actually break it down a little bit more. And one of the definitions that I really resonate to me on a story, and I'll actually bring it up for everybody here on a slide, because it's something I always like going back to. And so if you read anything from Stephen Denning, awesome author, great thought leader, but he wrote a book called A Leader's Guide to Storytelling. And in that book, he actually defines a story. And I really love his definition. Like, you can go through and you can find definitions of story everywhere, and they'll all be different. But to me, this is the one that is maybe the base of any given story. And he talks about it as an account of events that are causally connected in some way. The one I think about here is that a story is not the individual pieces that happen, but it's connecting one piece to another. The story is the line in between. That's what the story is. And so as we think about things, I was actually talking in the breakout, I think it was Patty, was talking about his visual storytelling that he does. And with his visual storytelling, he was trying to kind of show the like the Scrum process and like how things play out. And the thing is when you look at any given element in Scrum or something like that, you can say, cool, we've got the daily Scrum, we've got, planning, we've got, our retro, our review. Cool. Each one of those independently are a thing. I don't understand how they play together. But when you write the story that connects them together visually and verbally, you get it then. You kind of can see how things play out. And so that's to me that where I kind of resonate back to is storytelling is all kind of playing in that realm. I don't know, does that make sense to you, Mohammed? Kind of like that idea of connecting the dots?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, look at today's example. You know, we got Douglas talking about so in great intricate detail about putting his shoes on.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many parts to that entire journey from the start of the minute to the end of the 2 minutes.
Right.
And each one of those are independent components that are put together to achieve the outcome of the shoelace so he could get out. Or for John's case, slipping on his shoes.
Yeah, slip his, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, sorry. So one of the things I always look back to for stories as well is I've been fascinated by the history of storytelling. And so part of this presentation for folks is I want to kind of give you some ideas about how storytelling has evolved. Because as I've mentioned to you already, Mohammed and I even talked about, I mean, it's this idea that stories are all around us. They are things that we live and breathe with today, and they've been around with us for as long as we know. And so I actually went on a little bit of a journey to kind of figure out like how far do stories go back? Like what is some of the earliest evidence? And so I actually went and did some research, and I came across a couple of cool artifacts. And the first one here is this one. This is a cave drawing from some caves outside of in France, and the drawings are said to be depicting, or believed to be depicting, things like hunting success stories and mystical rituals. And these drawings are 17,000 years old. So to me, that's incredible. I mean, 17,000 years ago, we were trying to depict different things happening and trying to create a sense of story here. And so for me, this kind of blew my mind a little bit. But I kind of had this like tickle in the back of my mind. I was like, I wonder if it goes back any further. I wonder if we have stories that is it really only 17,000 years ago? But I found something that went about a little bit longer before that. And these stories actually came back 35,000 years ago. So 35,000 years ago in Indonesia, there's cave drawings of, again, things like mystical rituals, hunting success stories on these caves. And it's most fascinating about this is that this is truly the earliest signs of kind of a higher order of consciousness in our species. And what this means to me is that it's our ability to actually connect dots. It's to create a story. Different things happen, and now I can depict it, and I can recall it, and I can tell it to others. And so for me, this was really cool to be able to see that, wow, we've been telling stories for a very long time. Now, these are drawings. These aren't stories as even what we've been talking about today. And so for me, as I kind of wanted to look and say, well, what's the oldest story that we're used to? Things like books, things like movies, these sorts of things. And so I actually came across one, and it is known as the oldest of its kind. It is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's got a villain, it's got a hero, it's got climactic events. It's also 4,000 years old, and it's written across 12 clay tablets. And if actually you go out today, you'll notice it has a 4.2 star review rating on Amazon. So I highly recommend you check it out. It's actually, I picked up a copy. It's actually a pretty good story, and the reviews are evident of that. So
I read that. Very interesting.
Have you read that?
Yes.
I know, right? Isn't that crazy that it's like that?
But there is more. You know that they found more the tablet clays in the other cities, and they link to each other and they link But anyway, it's your thing. But yeah, I read.
I would highly recommend to exactly that point, go out there and check it out, folks. Kind of look at that. And because to me, it's like, wow, 4,000 years old, we were telling these kind of epic narratives. And we were starting to document those. And it's just, to me, that's why it was, and that's like that first sense of that for us. So I think that leads us into a really good question here of like, why do you think stories are so impactful? Like, why were we telling those like that? What was the cause? I don't know. I'd love to open it up, Mohammed, to you, to the rest of the audience. What do you guys think?
Let's go with the audience first. Let's see what they think.
I have an idea.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I grew up listening to my father tell amazing stories. And I always think of it as a teaching thing. It's how do I get across, this is the idea that I've got, in a way that you really remember it, and that you'll be able to tell it to your children one day as well. And to have that kind of that emotional hook in it that gives you that linear structure that you can, when you come back to it, oh yeah, I remember that story.
I remember that one, right? Exactly.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I've heard this one before. I know where this one goes.
Isn't there like a line out there? I think Maya Angelou may have said something. It's like something that's like, people won't remember necessarily what you did, but they'll remember how the way they made you feel.
Yeah.
You know, that's exactly it. It goes back to the emotional aspect that it pulls in.
But it's also about bringing maybe people
Awesome. What other thoughts?
It's also about maybe bringing people to an experience that you had. So you want to take them to feel something at that time that they can remember. So maybe those, what was shown on the cave was to show that this is what happened because it was really different for something, or this is just something that we really love, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So it's to share that experience and bring people to that, I suppose, joint experience if you can.
I love that. It's like that collective understanding perspective, right? You know, it's the same thing with what we went through with that icebreaker, where we have a collective understanding of now how both Douglas puts on his shoes and how Krishna puts on his coat. So we have that as a shared experience now.
Yeah.
But I think what happens with stories, and it's slightly different to the cave paintings, stories for me is about painting. I've said to you before, Mark, it's about painting pictures in people's heads. And therefore you tell a story and you connect with emotion, but you're also painting a picture, and therefore people relate to it better. Whereas if you just give people facts, there is no emotional hook.
What's really interesting, if I can respond to that maybe, Mark, is just the idea that, you know, when we are telling stories, facts are necessary and they're important, but I think it's about finding the right balance.
Yeah.
Between why that fact matters and why, when that fact says what it does, it means certain possibilities or options.
It's about giving facts in a way that engages the other person's emotions to a degree, rather than giving them just a cold fact. You're engaging their emotion, and therefore you get more of their buy-in, and they'll either remember it or they will go on the same journey as you because you've hooked them in.
Absolutely. A really good example here is this.
Picture.
Go ahead, Paul.
So it's saying that one picture is 1,000 words. So you can imagine if you create the story of many pictures, what actually happens, you remember the key elements of that story through the picture. So you'll never lose the story. This is how people pass all the knowledge, you know, before, when all the wisdom books was written, everything was actually in the head of, you know, primitive people. And then eventually they starting, you know, write it down. So how they remember so many words, they remember as the vivid story, because the one of the picture connecting to another, and they fill the gaps with words. That makes sense.
I love that. And it's funny. So I bring up this image here, and that's where I love where this conversation is going, because for me, I'm jumping ahead to one of the slides because it just so resonates right now. And so you guys bring up this aspect of emotion in here. And so like this idea of emotion in stories is so powerful. There's actually a study out there that was done in Stanford University about how does emotion, when interlaced with data, how does that help in our our ability to remember? And they actually found that people are 22 times more likely to remember facts when emotion isn't interlaced with it versus just the facts alone. So if I read it in a very emotional tone versus just very monotone, I'm much more able to remember those facts. And I think you guys hit on it so crisply here, where it's just like emotions are some of those things that help drive the impact, the impression it makes on us.
What are some of the ways, Mark, you would think we could do that? And how could we use emotion differently or better in how we tell stories?
I think it's going to be, and actually, I'm gonna to hold on that one as we get
Sure.
into some of the later parts that we're going to talk about. But just as a little bit of a taste, it's understanding the emotions that you want to elicit. It's not about the emotions that you have; it's about the emotion that you want someone else to have, and that's really where it's going to come down to. And it's going to be it's going to be becoming very intentional with your storytelling.
Can't wait to hear the rest. Go
One
ahead.
way I found it is when I'm writing user stories, most of the time I saw a lot of user stories where there is no emotional connectors, not clarifying the benefit to the user. As you said before, you're talking about as a system, I want it. I prefer not to write as a system. I want to prefer as a person, like as an actor, someone. What's the benefit I want a system to do so that the benefit is this, and this is what's going to happen. If you don't do that, what might happen usually engages people. That's the first point of engagement. Then you can add a bit more connection, and also providing the facts that's at the right balance with all the rules and the pictures, if you can find, or graphs, that helps the developers and testers and everyone understanding it more better and engaging with the customer directly as a product owner, or the, when you're telling the story to the developers. And that works better. That's I thought is more. I saw more benefit in it, because a lot of the times what is the benefit is missing. Most of the time we present the fact and we won't tell the benefit of doing that. And in the story, that's where a lot of disengagement happens.
What I shared earlier in our breakout is about, I used to work on a service desk, and I would be talking to people working in shops, and they had no idea about IT at all. And they would phone in because something had gone wrong, and we'd have a major instance. So the whole company would have the same problem, but because they were emotionally worked up about the fact theirs wasn't working, they would try and get me to do theirs first. It wasn't possible. So I would tell a story to explain to them why I couldn't do it. And my go-to was, I used to say regularly, imagine you're on the Titanic and we've hit the iceberg. What you're asking me to do is put some more ice in your drink. I can't do that till I've sorted out the iceberg. And once I've done that, if you're then not happy with your drink, I'll come back to you. And people then, because I'd taken it away from that IT place and that problem they had and made it to something they could visualize and understand, and they understood one's a big thing and one's a little, because I gave them a bit of a story and a bit of a picture, they'd often go away happier than me just saying, no, can't sort it out.
I love that use of that metaphor. Really, really powerful.
It's all connecting together. And actually, I want to take this for both what Alice has said and what Krishna said and kind of bring you guys into this little story I want to tell you here. So, and it ties in so well, because what we're looking at here is this ability to connect to people. And when we connect to people with a story, it's amazing the power it has. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is an fMRI scan of a storyteller and a listener, so you have the speaker and the listener. And what we're seeing here is essentially the amount of kind of brain activity that's going on as a story is being listened to as well as portrayed. And one of the things that gets interesting, and when scientists ran this study, they kind of saw something that surprised them. And basically what they found is that if you take the brain activity of a storyteller and you take the brain activity of someone listening to that story and you put them on top of each other, they are almost identical. And you think about that and you're like, that's kind of odd. Like, why would that be the case? I mean, you get somebody who's lived and breathed this thing and somebody who's just listening to someone talk about it. And so as they went into it, they realized it's actually not that odd. And the fact is it comes down to what we call in the storytelling world, the storytelling cocktail. And this is a pretty strong cocktail. If you can get it right, it will bring somebody past a barrier. It will get somebody to think past their problem. So just like Alice's example, like, oh, this is my problem. And it helps them think about things in a different light. And so for us, as we think about this actually has to do with the chemicals in our brains. And so there are three chemicals that are kind of kicking off that make a really good story stick with us. The first one here is cortisol. And so cortisol, if when hearing a good story or hearing a story that we can potentially connect to, all of a sudden cortisol starts kicking off and we're paying much more attention. Cortisol is that attention grabbing drug. It's something that's heightening our focus. We're now listening to everything you're saying and not just kind of somewhat listening. You also have the great chemical of dopamine. So as we all know, dopamine's the pleasure drug. It's a thing that when I say, hey, who wants chocolate? And people are like, ooh, I like chocolate. I want some chocolate. You're getting a little, yeah, so Muhammad raised his hand. He's got a little dopamine right now in his head that's kicking off saying, hey, give me some of that. But the cool thing about dopamine too is it's also the learning reinforcement drug. It's that thing that helps us to say, hey, we've done something. It was pleasurable because one, maybe we liked it, or two, we've connected dots in our head that we couldn't connect before. So i.e. a story is connecting independent pieces and our brain's saying, I like that. They're connecting dots for me. I want to hear more of that. And so dopamine's kicking off saying, yeah, you want this. So keep paying attention. You want more of this. And then finally, there's what the kind of the punch out here. And this is what they even would talk about as the wonder drug is oxytocin. And so oxytocin is that drug that, a couple of years ago, I only associated that with the chemical that got released when a baby was born, and both from a new baby and a mother, they wanted to essentially bring them together early on because they were both releasing high levels of oxytocin to help them bond. But the thing is oxytocin is in all of us, and really what oxytocin is it's considered the empathy drug. It's the drug that says, hey, put yourself in this other person's shoes. Think about things from their perspective. And so now you think about this with a great story. We just heard, a couple of these earlier. I've got a good story I'm listening to. It's taking my attention. My cortisol's going. I like it because it's starting to connect dots for me that maybe I hadn't connected before. So my dopamine's kicking in. And then ultimately, the oxytocin's saying, hey, put yourself in their shoes. Think about it as though you're going through it. So there's no wonder that when we look back at this diagram, the things, the brainwaves look the same. For a listener, if I have a good story, I feel the story is my story. And thus, I can actually think about this as something that I want to pursue. I want to do differently because I think it's my own story. So I found this fascinating as we go through this.
What's coming up for me here, Mark, just very quickly, is this idea where very often as an Agile coach, I hear this complaint, or even when I was working as a Scrum Master, is stakeholders don't want to attend our demos. What's the point of doing these sprint reviews and putting all this effort in, but nobody attends? It's just
nobody attends it, right?
And what you're spinning up for me here is, what is the cortisol and oxytocin and dopamine that we need to help release for those stakeholders to lure them to join? What is it that the teams aren't doing? And I suppose I'm looking at it from this perspective. Instead of saying, well, they're not doing it, the question is, what can we do to engage them better through these three chemicals, if you like? But obviously, we got to find ways to.
You're 100% right. And I think I'd be curious to hear what others think about this too, because it kind of goes into this what about Agile concept, as we think about like, all right, cool, we know about stories, but how does this play into what we're doing day to day now? And so that's a great example. How do you engage your stakeholders? What do you guys think from an audience when you think about the power, the knowing that internally in our bodies, we are built for stories? Like we have drugs that literally when brought together help us tell stories better. I mean, what do you think to Muhammad's question?
Give them a little taste, like snack.
Lace it in there.
Exactly, with the little story, oh, we done something really interesting, but we don't tell you the rest. You have to come back.
Yeah, so a little bit of marketing. So, marketing is really good.
Exactly, so you can drop the email, like, and then, but you will find out later.
I think a lot of it as well is trying to because I think from a stakeholder point of view, a lot of the main question they're probably asking themselves is so what? How does this affect me? Why would I? There's got to be some benefit for them. So I suppose it's about trying to get them to realize the value that you're bringing to their lives.
And
change.
I also think, as somebody that is not that technically minded, I go every morning, I go to a stand-up twice a week for a project I'm on, and a lot of it is very techy. and sometimes they're talking a language I don't fully understand,
Yeah.
and therefore if something else comes up, I will go to this something else, because
Yeah.
I sat there thinking, you're not engaging me, you're
Mhm.
not, you're engaged with within your group, you're all quite whatever, but you have to remember, not your audience aren't always on the same wavelength you are. You've got to talk on my
Mhm.
wavelength if you want me to come every time.
That
Yeah,
does
speak their language.
however, that
Yeah.
does assume, however, that you are their audience rather
Yeah,
than they
but
are their own audience.
yeah, I think within technical teams, people
Mm.
tend to make the assumption that everybody speaks the same as they do.
Yeah.
And
It comes back down to the idea of knowing your audience, and
Mhm.
ultimately to that question even that Muhammad brought up is like, you are going to ultimately be the person telling that story. So if you go back to this, the question is, how do you get that listener to think it's their story? And it's connecting them with the lowest common denominator. It's, Alice, you brought up that great story about the, how you connect people to what's going on when they don't understand. So using like an analogy, it's actually one of the techniques that's out there, and I'll show you guys a little bit later here on terms of how you can construct a story. But basically, pulling something like an analogy that can connect people together on terms of why something is important is really powerful, because then we both look at it and we're like, cool, we get that, we can both see the same thing now.
Mark, I'm wondering if this is a good time to take a quick pause. We're sort of 50-ish minutes into the game.
Yeah.
What do you say? What does everybody else want to do? Are you intrigued to hear more now and not take a break, or shall we take 5-10 minutes?
I can go on.
I think so. We can carry on. It's good,
Carry on?
actually.
Yeah.
Is there anybody who does want to take a break?
I
Maybe
love the
after reverse
conversation
question?
so far, guys. This has
I
been
maybe
great.
need to take a 5 minutes.
Okay, good. Fair play. Let's take 5 minutes.
do
I think it's
5.
only fair. We promised it to many people. Let's take a
Mhm.
quick stretch break. Grab yourselves a drink, some water, whatever it is, and that'll give Mark a break as well to grab himself a drink too. So let's come back in 5 minutes.
Okay, great.
Beautiful.
See you in a couple of minutes.
For those that don't want to take a break, feel free to stick back and continue the banter. Mark, you can take a break if you wish. No
I'll be
problem.
on here for the next 5 minutes, so we can keep going. And I'm just kind of looking to, I think I'm going to rearrange some of my presentation, because I love where we're going here with some of this.
Yeah. Well,
This
everyone else.
is a really fascinating, honestly, to me as a presenter, this is a very fascinating way to go through this conversation, because usually it's a one-way conversation a lot of times. Usually me presenting. So to have the dialogue back and forth, this has been fun.
Yeah. For those of you that are still here on the call and you're still hearing, is the format working so far? Is it feeling good?
It is very good, yeah,
Yeah.
to be honest. Yeah, it is
Yeah.
very, two-way, as Mark said, it is two-way and it's more engaging. And learning from
More
different
more
experiences.
storytelling.
Yes, more story. I like your story way of telling, I like the Titanic ship one, and that's something related to one. Yeah, yeah.
It was
I have
really interesting.
I have allegories for everything. I'm a great allegory person. It's like, yeah, let's make it real world for everybody.
One thing you're
was
going to find is you're going to start creating, just like what you saying, Alice. You've got those things for everything. One of the things you'll find, and I'll even talk about this as a practice coming up, is start collecting those. Because the thing is it's great. Like if you come across a really good one, you're like, oh, I love that. Write that down and put it away, because guess what? You can likely use that for other things as you're moving forward. Though you also find.
I was saying earlier to Mark, I was saying when I worked on the desk, the other people on the desk would go, oh no, Alison's telling another story. because I had, like, for different issues and different problems, I had like you say, I had a load of different stories that fitted different issues, and the people on the desk would hear them a few times a day, and they go, oh no, it's another one of Alison's stories.
Well, that's perfect, because I mean, Alice, you just fitting it right perfectly to what I will be talking about next when we get back from the break, because I want to start talking about story characteristics and actually like how you can construct one, because I think you hit on one where you might have like a great story, but then you try to like use it across all these different things, and you'll find that some of the times it works and some of the times it doesn't, because if you have a good one, you think you got a hammer and everything looks like a nail, and you're like, cool, I'm going to use this. And the thing is just you got to be much more conscious than that, right?
Yeah, you also have to judge your
world.
audience, because if you've got somebody that's shouting and swearing at you, you don't then mention Titanic.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Judge your audience, because sometimes it can make things a lot worse.
Yeah. Tailoring to the stakeholder needs is the key for any storytelling, isn't it?
Oh, amen.
Some people simply like a fact and they don't bother about what is it, and they want to get on develop it. Some people like emotion to it. What's the benefit? Why I'm doing it? What's the reason behind it? So you need to provide. And the most of the time, common thing is most of the time people get facts right, but they don't connect any emotion, like providing the benefit or understanding the audience is the lacking bit. That's where, and also they'll be a bit not flexible enough, understanding the technical difficulties or anything like that. For example, the other day, some of the business rules they want to provide they want a story that covers a person to travel to do auditing in a train, bus, and in plane, and they're missing the bit of how technical feasibility in order to, and that's for next 1.5 years. So usually the flight schedules only come out for 6 months. And you're talking about international flight schedules. You can't simply connect to the Google and get the details or anything like that. So those kind of things you need to be telling back to the audience, saying, see guys, you want whole world, but the technical feasibility is somewhere here, and if you give us money and do all the time we can do it, but in order to have a small benefit, how much money you want to spend, those kind of things, giving them the facts back and providing the what it is meant and the technical difficulties behind it, I think sometimes makes their life easier. Then they can understand what they want as well. Sometimes stakeholders doesn't understand what they want. You need to be careful enough, when you're communicating back to them, telling them, where we are, and bringing them to the level, what we can deliver, not putting their expectations really high and all this stuff. It's mainly tailoring your communications and writing the enough detail and providing between the business and to the technical people. I think that's like you need to find the right balance between them. That's what I learned in this industry from a long time.
Absolutely. Thanks for
Right.
sharing.
Thanks
Let's
everyone for
get
the.
back-
Could I
let's
ask
get
Krishna
back to
a
the-
quick question?
Go for it, Mike.
So Krishna, you were talking about facts and how important they are, especially in your day job. But I'm wondering whether you ever write backgrounds to any of the stuff that you put out there. So really contextualize what it is that you're talking about, right?
Yes.
A lot of teams and a lot of stakeholders get a lot of value for understanding, well, not only what is it that we're going to achieve, but why is it that we're trying to achieve it? And certainly that's part of the story.
Yes, definitely.
Indeed, and a lot of the thoughts I've had over this course of this evening has been Mike Burrow and his book about right to left, and moving, literally focusing on the end result and the goal you're trying to achieve, and then how did you get there? As opposed to, this is the route I took. I went down the stairs, I put my shoes on, I went out the door after I'd put my coat on, or multiple coats. I got in the car and I drove to the office, and then I wrote some software. And then after all of that, I've then given you a piece of software that you might be able to use to do your job. Focus on the, let's do that stuff over there before we explain how we've delivered this. Because you've already got the engagement of those people. They've got what they wanted, hopefully, before you then focus on it, on how we delivered this. Because, if they wander off at that point, they wander off. That's the nature of the world. One question I do have, though, about the chemical cocktail, other than where is the olive? Because food always helps.
Where is the olive? That's actually a good question.
Is there a particular chemical makeup for different types of story, or is this all stories?
So the way I found it, and the research I've done, is there's actually there's a researcher by the name of Paul Zak that kind of is kind of coined this idea, is that based on everything I've read, is that there isn't, the type of story actually doesn't necessarily apply, but what it does is that the story itself is something that you'll get pulled into, and so that's where if you can kick off your cortisol, your dopamine, and your oxytocin. You create something someone wants to engage in, and then the story itself, what you create, you can then drive where you're taking that. And actually, that's where, for me, I've actually, and I'll introduce to you guys here in a little bit, this framework I've kind of been using just to help myself figure out how to tell stories better, is it helps me try to think about, cool, I'm going to try to tell a compelling story that kicks those chemicals off for somebody. But now what do I want them to do? Do I want to just communicate facts? Do I want them to actually take action on something? Do I want to do good news or bad news? What do I want to do? And as long as I can craft a story that can connect those together and kind of, again, tell something compelling that kicks those off, the story itself is actually almost agnostic at that point. So you'll basically, if you craft a good story in whatever way, you'll get those things playing off. And that's where, if like what we were talking about earlier with Alice, is that if you tell a story that doesn't get those things going, you may think you have the best story ever, but all of a sudden, people aren't connecting the dots the way you think it would. Those chemicals aren't kicking off, and so for them, they're not feeling that story is impacting them anymore. So that's the way I've kind of come to look at that.
Do you have a way, Mark, to know whether to kind of gauge the engagement as you're telling the story? Do you have any kind of success metrics, so to speak, as you're telling? Do you know what I mean?
Well, one, did they do what I asked them to do?
How do you know?
Ultimately, I'm trying to get them to do something a lot of the times. I think it's, and I want them to either look at something a different way. I want them to ask themselves a different question. And if they proceed through that, well, usually that, for me, that's an indicator for me that I'm moving forward. And actually, I'll share with you guys some of those things here too, because there's a couple things you look at to kind of say, hey, this is ultimately what I want them to do, and now I can use that to then ultimately see whether or not my story is successful. Like, did I get someone to join me along for this journey? Did I get somebody to reevaluate something and then come back and then ask a new type of question? And if I did, awesome, I've got that. Interesting with storytelling, you'll find is that, if you got a good performer, and this is the storyteller is part of this, and we'll talk about that too. That's part of the equation. You can get somebody engaged, you can pull them in, but the thing is if it's like it's like a Trojan horse. If you bring it in and there's no substance to the story, you might have got them engaged, but now they don't know what to do. They're like, cool, I love what you told me, but what do I do next? And so it's really impactful that when you create that good story, you actually have the payload. You have what is it, the ultimate message I want to do? So actually, I'm going to keep us rolling into that, because I think those are some of the things we're going to get into here in the next part here as we talk, because it's like, all right, cool. If I make a good story now, like, great, but how do I actually create a good story? I think that's a big thing.
Mark, I wonder if I can.
And so for me, oh yeah, go for it.
Sorry. So do you find that you often use, say, techniques like putting holes in your stories? And by that, I mean, you intentionally create opportunities to pull people in and have them contribute, so that you're coactively contributing towards the creation of the story. That's a fairly good way, I find, to really bring people in, to get them engaged, to make them feel like they're stakeholders in the outcome of that story. And they tend to remember it a lot better, rather than just passively sitting back and trying to listen to you and remember everything you have to say.
100%. And I think that's a great technique, where you can go through and actually figure out, all right, how do I, it goes back into ultimately what's your goal. And to your point, your goal here with a story is to help them to, again, not take a back seat, not be passive in it, but actually engage. And so you may actually leave intentional fill in the blanks that says, all right, what's the next spot in the story? If you've done anything with improv, you'll and this for everybody, if you've done anything with improv, you'll notice some of the stories that they do is they'll ask for aspects to be added to the story, and then people will add that in there, and thus it makes the story a little bit more like, oh cool, I contributed to this. Those same principles can apply into this kind of storytelling to help people kind of think about their stories in a way that says, cool, I contributed to this.
And from a business perspective, we often use personas, don't we? So we often create a framework and a structure, and then start saying, okay, now let me explain who this persona is. Now, how do you think that persona would interact at this point? And that way you can try and put people in somebody's shoes, you can interact with them like that, and they can contribute. And that's another good way of trying to engage them, I feel.
Absolutely.
Oh, personas too are such a great piece to that. And like something I've done in the past with my personas is when we write user stories, we write our user stories for our personas. You know, like those are the people. It's not anybody else. It's whoever that persona is. I'm writing the user story for, so I can, to your point, put them in that shoes, being like, hey, what would John, John Jameson need for this, and it's like, oh, what would John need for this if I know that persona? And to your point, I'm building that empathy in that case.
And in fact, we saw that a little bit earlier on when we were putting on shoes. So guys are putting on trainers and lacing them up, and ladies are deciding which shoes to wear. So, oh, by the way, Douglas, if he's back, you didn't put your socks on.
He missed that. And isn't that great? Those little pieces that you pick up like that, and it's like, oh wait, what about this? And that's the exact conversation you then want to have when you're talking with your team. Like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. You're right. They're owning the outcome then in that case, right? That's really what we're getting to.
Well, clearly he put his socks on before he came downstairs.
All right, Mark, let's move on.
All right, we'll keep going, guys. I love the banter. So one of the things I always look for, so I'll kind of tell you again, continuing to talk to you a little bit about my storytelling journey. One of the things that I started looking at was honestly what makes a good story, because for me, what makes a good story can help me craft a good story. And so actually one of the first people I looked to was actually one of the most famous storytellers of our age. Someone who's been iconic, who's an icon for great storytelling, and that's our good friend Walt Disney. Walt Disney has, before he passed away, he actually talked about like what he looks for and what he makes sure is present in his stories that he tells. For him, he has three characteristics. He's got a story has to create a character that is unique but loved. And I love this because I think about it, at least in the States, I'm sure all over the world this is the way, but there are whole aisles in home improvement stores dedicated to the eradication of small creatures we call mice from our homes. Yet for many of us, we have our kids sleeping with stuffed animals of them. And so the fact that Mickey Mouse is such a unique character, but he's loved by nearly everybody, that is an icon that will live throughout the ages. You also have things that like he would look for in his stories, that he wants to allow the audience to become part of something more. They want to invite Mickey, you to see how Mickey interacts with his world. Give him things that he's going to go through, trials and tribulations, so that we can understand and again build empathy for him as he goes through. And then he also says you have to play with the unknown. And this goes back into, with storytelling, you can't have a predictable next step. It was funny, I was actually reading, I do a lot of audible books. So I listen to a lot of books, and I'm on vacation right now, and we actually were driving up, and there was a really great part in a book where I was like, oh, I know this is going to happen. This is the next steps. And then they threw me for a loop. And I was like, oh no, that wasn't what it was, And that's what he mentioned. That's what Walt means here. Is this idea that you have to be able to introduce new elements that causes the character to interact in ways that you wouldn't expect. So before with Mickey, Mickey, how does he interact now when he has Pluto? How does he interact when he has Daisy or Donald? These caused him to interact in new ways and in his environment. And so for me, Disney's a great character to go, or individual to go back to and say, these are some characteristics that we can kind of latch onto at first. But for me, as I kind of went through, I started saying, well, what are the characteristics I find are impactful in stories? So we mentioned this earlier, even during the break, if you're still listening, it's like coming up with that catalog of stories that you found you really like or really impactful. The same thing goes with kind of characteristics. Like, what do you look for in a story? For me, I look for stories that include something like an underdog or a hero to root for, something that is going to rally my folks around it. And of course, you need to have an antagonist to that. You need to have a villain we're going to root against. We're going to say, and that it's funny, I talk about this in like my UX community too. And one of the things I said is a villain doesn't have to be a person. A villain could be a poor user experience. Like that was one of the things we used in that situation for a story for them. It's like, yeah, that's the thing we're rooting against. There's always got to be some sort of conflict that stimulates growth for me. There's got to be some, I can't just say things are good, are bad, now things are good. Well, what caused that? What's the dot? How are we connecting the dots together? And ultimately for me, I gravitate towards stories that help create a vision of a brighter tomorrow. And these are stories that typically I find that people see themselves in as the characters. I try to navigate towards more what I call personal stories, stories where I hear from folks and say, hey, I want to gravitate towards that story, and even leverage it to kind of say, hey, this is a story I heard about somebody. Because a lot of times when we can hear something that we can relate to at a personal level, it hooks a lot easier into us. And then, of course, have that that twist or memorable aspect. You've got to have something that causes somebody to say, just like me in that book I was listening to, that says, oh, hey, I remember that because I was expecting this thing to happen and it didn't. It happened this way. And I was like, oh, snap. So these are things that I look for. Now, one of the things I'll challenge all of you with today, as we're kind of going through this, is I think it's really important that all of us think about what makes an important story for us. So as you're listening to the stories we've been telling here, as well as the stories you hear in the world, start honing in on what makes sense. Like really listen to people and think about the stories they're telling. And if you're like, I really like this story, start figuring out why. Like, what is it about that story that you like? And those start becoming the characteristics that you start feeling rooted in as you're that you may find are in a sweet spot for you to help kind of tell a story that you are both going to be emotionally involved with, like you're going to be invested in, but it's one that could be impactful. All right, so I'm going to keep us going. So these are just some of the things I have, and I want to keep us going a little bit because I have an activity I want all of you to do here in just a second, and then we'll kind of start closing it out with talking about, how does a storyteller play in, that kind of good stuff. But I want to tell you a little story here about how I kind of got into storytelling. Because for me, as I started looking, I was a Scrum Master actually at the time, working for a financial firm, and I was trying to figure out how do I better tell stories. And for me, it was like, all right, I've read all the books. They all tell me about different stories, and they're all different in terms of their technique. But all of them talk about kind of the story as it is itself. It says, hey, you're going to tell a story about something, someone's going through some sort of challenge, they change, awesome. But I was like, well, sometimes that doesn't, like that. My stories need to be a little different. They need to be something that talk about ultimately a change I'm trying to draw out, or maybe I just want to lead someone towards a different understanding, or like being just aware of something. And so I started kind of playing around with kind of all these different things, and I crafted here what I call the storytelling framework, and or as many have alluded it to, is the storytelling igloo. And so here what we're looking at is basically the elements that I found that are really necessary to create an impactful story. And I'll kind of walk through it, like it's just a super high level what each of these kind of play out with. And then I'll also share with you all a link here. Actually, I'll do it right now. To a copy of this, so that way you can all, take this and leverage it as needed. But basically, for me, as I look at this, every story is going to have what we call the arc around it. And that's the it's going to start somewhere, it's going to end somewhere. And for me, I've got to have a character. They're going to go through they have a challenge. They're going to face that challenge during a journey, and they're going to learn something. And then ultimately, they're going to hit some form of resolution where they're going to come out different on the other side. And so all my stories, I try to make sure I have that arc to it. Otherwise, I might leave a cliffhanger, and thus I'm not actually getting to what I need the story to do. Now, that's kind of the arc of the story. Now, let's get into the meat of what a story is. And so for me, I always start out then when I think about, and it came up earlier, it's like, what is the outcome in mind, someone said. And to me, what I call it the universal truth. What's the thing I want to have understood at the end of this? And the universal truth is typically, I think the analogy I heard once, which I really liked, was the universal truth is like the medicine you want someone to take, and the story is the sweet liquid you mix it into. That way, people are much more willing to understand, like take in that message, and not realize they're actually getting a message that they may not have wanted originally, or they may not have been seeking. And so universal truth is just very important, because otherwise, if you don't know why you're trying to tell a story, like what's the outcome in mind, you're just telling a story. You're not going to make anything that's impactful. So you're always going to start with the universal truth. As you move down, you're going to go into the type of story that you're going to look at. You're going to look at a personal story. So that's one thing that you've experienced, or maybe someone you're acquainted with has experienced, something that you can talk about where someone could potentially relate to. Now, if you don't have a good enough story for something, again, don't try to make a square peg fit into a round hole. This is where you can also lean back to fables, folk tales, analogies. These are like the Titanic example is a perfect fit into this area where you say, I can communicate my message through an analogy or through a story that is, something that's just been in through the ages. And those are your two types of stories that you can select. And so for me, I always like to say, all right, what type of story am I going to select? And then the next layer here we have is, if we think about it, we get our truth, we have a story, but now in the story, I want to try to maybe get a certain message across. And that goes back to my universal truth. If I'm trying to get someone to re-examine how they do their retrospectives, let's say, I may say, well, what should I be focusing on as a story? Should I be focusing on, just sharing knowledge, or brand awareness? Or maybe in this case, I want to inspire some sort of change. I want to actually, in this case, when I think about inspiring change, I want someone to ultimately take action on something afterwards. Whereas in brand awareness, I just want them to be aware of something. And so for me, I want to figure out from what perspective I want to essentially tell my story from. In inspiring change, I need to be talking about something that's positive, and I need to end with something that is calling to action what somebody needs when they need someone to do. So I need them to do something for me. And so these are different things that you'll be looking at in terms of the types of story and how you want to kind of craft your story. And then finally, one of the most important things, because if you have everything else, you've got a story, but you may not get things like the oxytocin kicking off in your brain when someone's hearing a story, and that comes down to the details. The details are just so imperative because they, again, help you to paint a picture where people can picture themselves in there. And when they do that, that's when my empathy starts. That's when I can start seeing myself in something that maybe I couldn't have before. And so these are all aspects of a good story. And for me, if you look through this guide I sent out, I actually try to give you just some things to think about as you go through, like, what does it mean for structure? What does it mean for universal truth, etc. And this is something I'd highly recommend, take a look at, see if it helps you out in your process. Now, for me, what I'm going to actually have you guys do is I actually want you to actually leverage this as a technique to help you figure out what kind of story you want to tell. And I actually want to walk you through like an example here, because when we go back over into this guide, so if you have that link, you get into the thing, and on the very back here, we have a list of different attributes. And think of this as kind of like a template you can use. Here you're going to identify for a type of story you're trying to tell, like, who's your character? What's the challenge they're going to go through? Ultimately, what's the universal truth you're targeting? What's the journey that they're going to go through to understand that universal truth? You can kind of do things like call out, like, am I going to pick a personal story or a fable of folktale? Am I trying to approach it from an inspiring change or maybe a future telling? And then there's a couple other attributes we can do. Like, what do I ultimately want them to learn? How will the story resolve and end? Like, what will come out at the other side? And then also look to do things like list out some details. What these all represent are some aspects here that will help guide you in identifying how to actually craft your story, because all these attributes need to be in there. And now by thinking about these, you can look at your story and say, hey, am I hitting on the details? Oh, you know what? I need to probably add some more details in here, or else maybe this won't connect as well for folks. And so I figured I'll show you a quick example of one, just kind of get an idea. So, so how do you use the framework here? So here's an image of that here. So I actually have a story that I've got that I actually tell a lot, because it's something for me that I saw a huge impact in terms of how teams look at like retrospectives and how the power of it. And it has to do with a team that was struggling with like the value of a retrospective. And they were also struggling in other areas too. They were struggling with things like test integration. And so for me, the story I have in this case is going to be about a fellow Scrum Master I knew, and her name's Katie, and it was her Scrum team in mind. And the challenge that they were having is they were going through, and Katie's team was struggling with understanding the ramifications of delaying testing to the end of a sprint. And so that was ultimately the challenge that they were having. And the thing that they were going through is they really couldn't understand how to fix this. And a lot of times we kind of say, is from an agile perspective, is like, hey, let's maybe retro this a little bit. Let's talk about what's going on and how we can make it better. And so ultimately, the thing that we started looking at was like, well, what's the thing that we want to get across here? And he says, well, we want to make sure that the team knows that a retrospective can help them go deeper into topics. So okay, so they're struggling with this. They ultimately need to have, there needs to be a retrospective here to help them through the process. And so we should say, all right, in our story we're telling, how do we actually, like, if this is our story, how are we going to actually go through this journey? And so within Katie's team, what I actually had them do was I actually had them play a game called Testing Jenga to actually learn about the impacts of delaying testing. Now, the ramification, like knowing what testing Jenga is all about is not as important as connecting the dots to say, hey, this team is struggling. This team was struggling with test integration. They went into a retrospective where they actually did a different approach to retrospectives. They actually played a game to show them the impacts of doing things. This to me is a story. It's a personal story. It's one that I can say I've experienced because I helped coach them through this. And it's one that I ultimately want to use in the future to inspire change. I actually want to take this story, and when I work with teams that are struggling to see the value of things like a retrospective, or are struggling to figure out how do we go beyond just the superficial, what went well, what didn't go well, how you can evolve a retro. And so I want to inspire them to change the way they're looking at the world. So ultimately, then I want them to learn that retros can help a team over a learning gap. It's not just, what's going on now, but what's a learning gap we have. And then in my story, I want to have that essentially resolve out to be that team plays testing Jenga. They see the value of testing early and often, and that retros can reveal a lot of new learnings for them. And so from that, I can see, okay, I've kind of got my arc. The story I'm going to start telling here is going to be about, Katie's team. Katie's team struggled with integration. They didn't really have a lot of time or they didn't really talk about it beyond the fact that they were always behind, that they had issues. But then we decided that says, hey, let's actually do a retrospective on this. And instead of doing it in a traditional format, we actually decided to play a game called Testing Jenga. Testing Jenga allowed them to see if they tested early, or if they tested at the end, and they had to essentially break down their Jenga tower at the end based on pieces that were identified, they might actually lose stability in their tower. But if throughout a couple rounds, we were able to show them that if you brought testing into the very beginning of the tower creation, they could actually gain stability and complete their tower much quicker than if they had to wait till the end and let the tower potentially collapse. And so through that, they were able to see the value of testing early and often. And that, actually through this retro, they actually learned something about themselves. Now for me, I can use that story to talk to a team, but again, I'm trying to elicit things like that oxytocin. And so for me, I also want to add in some story details here. So let's see here. I can add in things like the wooden Jenga cubes with smeared black lettering. So I remember I took a couple boxes of wooden Jenga cubes, and I actually was writing the numbers on them to help them through this process. And I remember getting it all on my fingers, and it was all over the cube, but it still worked. Also, the rumble of the Jenga cube was when the towers fell. So that first round, when they went through, you could hear the clutter of Jenga towers falling as they realized that, boy, we didn't pull out cubes till the very end for our testing, and that was a problem for us. And then also for me, I also look at the space. I remember us being in this very large kind of multi-purpose room for this, and so it goes back to the sound. Like we were in this very large room, and so the sound reverberated across the walls, so you could hear when we hit a wall. So for me, this is what I use to kind of say, all right, do I have everything in my story? Is everything in place? And so that's kind of how you can kind of go about using this framework, is kind of looking at it, trying to, at least if you have a story, start kind of figuring out what aspects of it need to be true. What do you want to call out to make sure that when you tell that story, you're hitting all the markers.
That's a very powerful framework there, Mark.
Yeah.
Really, really powerful. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Mohammed.
Just a quick one, Mark. Before
yeah,
you
go
do,
for it, man.
Apologies. Just before you introduce the next session, I'm just a little bit conscious of the timing.
Oh yeah, how much time do
we
we got left?
have about 10-ish minutes maximum, and I know your exercise is a bit longer than that. Is there
Okay.
can you do any improv on the exercise, or is there other areas perhaps you think you could cover?
Yeah, so I'd say maybe what we'll do is we'll hold off on the exercise then, but I will leave that as maybe some homework for folks. And
Yeah,
so we
absolutely.
can go through that. So basically, to give you guys an idea, what I was going to have you do was go through and actually try to craft a story around how you'd tell a team about the value of a daily scrum. And so that's one thing I'll kind of challenge you all to think about is like, how could you craft that story and see if you can leverage the framework for that. So I'll kind of finish this off then with a couple other things. So the next part of this last part we're going to go through is going to be talking about the storyteller themselves. And so for me, this is a quote that just speaks to the power of a good storyteller. Margaret Lightman, she's a fantastic storyteller. She's actually a comedian turned like true storyteller, and she talks about this fact that a person who can keep us on the edge of our seat while talking about a turkey sandwich, they're a truly gifted storyteller. And she's right, because a lot of this from storytelling perspective is coming down to how we present ourselves in our storytelling. And so, Mohammed, I'd love to ask you kind of like, what have you seen? Like, what's a good story? Like, what are the characteristics of a good storyteller? Not just the story, but the actual, like, how the person is telling that story.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this was a big learning for me on my journey, because before I would stand up in front of people, I would shatter and anxiety and my mouth would go dry and all of that good stuff. But a few things that I learned, I suppose, in terms of being able to tell the story. One is obviously have a story to tell. So use the structure that you've, for example, provided earlier on and craft something out, firstly. But in terms of the storyteller themselves, I think we've lost a lot of that in the virtual world now that we're working in this way. But back in the day, I think it was more like if your audience is close to you, you could literally engage them by looking straight at them. So for example, if you could do a demonstration or a sprint review and you want to acknowledge somebody's done something good for you or unblocked a decision for you or helped you get a budget, you should maybe look at them, go and touch them on their back and say, thanks, Martin, for helping us resolve this. And in that way, you're engaging people and you're also bringing them in. So I think that the sense of touch,
it's such a critical thing is engaging people, right? You've got to, like you mentioned, eye contact. That's a huge item. Otherwise, you're going to go to a spot where people aren't going to feel connected to you.
Absolutely. The problem with, I think, where we are now doing this type of thing is a lot of what you do when you tell a story is you gauge the audience's reaction and you adjust your story accordingly based on that reaction.
Like body language and body language and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, and you can do it in this sort of, when you're looking at people's faces. What you can't do is when people don't turn their cameras on, and therefore you have no non-verbal cues at all. And I have said before, as somebody that relies on it a lot, if I'm not getting those non-verbal cues, I will either waffle forever because I don't know how to close it down, or I'll shut down completely. So people need to turn their cameras on, because that's all we've got.
Otherwise, if you just have, if you just have this where it's just somebody's image, that's on the screen, and it's like, or even just a black image, it's really hard to gauge a lot of that engagement, right?
Yeah. And it's a bit like a comedian being a stand-up comedian in an empty hall. You need that feedback. It's so you can do it in this world, but you need people to turn their cameras on. So my go-to is always turn your cameras on.
I think so is as well the charisma of the person. If it's speaking without any enthusiasm, or don't know the story, or actually it's actually saying because someone said you should say that without putting the heart or any emotion, that will be spotted straight away. After a few seconds, everyone will think so, oh, I don't want to listen to that. And if someone can bring the people, even like, for example, sometimes we don't see the things, we have audiobooks these days or something like that, and if it's good narrator, the person who is speaking, you suddenly you're drawn to that thing, that it's actually bringing the whole story. And the same when you're talking over phone, you can talk with someone from America and suddenly you heard like that person, and that you have this straight away, you click. So this is something which is going in immediately. It's in a matter of seconds.
It's amazing where I love the fact that you bring up audiobooks, because there's another version of this talk where I actually talk about that as an analogy, because you're right, because like things like when you can't see somebody, it is up to you, and I'll even talk about that here in a little bit in a second too, is you can't control you, and things like your enthusiasm, your level of engagement and tone and inflection can really play in, because audiobooks are a great example. I've listened to some audiobooks that are just super engaging, and like I'm driving and I get that moment where I forgot, like, oh crap, I've driven like 20 kilometers. How far have I been? Because you've just been listening to the book. But then there's also those books where I listen to and it's not engaging me enough, and I'm always hitting rewind because I drifted off. I started thinking of something else. And so even if your camera's off, there's certain things you can do to try to engage somebody, though. There's always going to be a level of effectiveness there.
But I think audiobooks are a good example, because I'm a great audiobook listener. Is a lot of the time it's not the story that's the problem, it's the narration. And if they've got 100%. If they've got a dull monotone voice, it doesn't matter how good the book was, you can't listen to it.
I hope you guys are excited to talk about storytelling today. This is going to be a really good time.
But there's also the opposite.
Can you imagine if I was talking like that for the last hour and a half?
But there's also been the opposite that I've noticed, is that some of them, they just talk at such a rate that you can't actually spend any time focusing, and they don't even do breaks between chapters. It's like, I'll return.
And you guys are just hitting on so many good points. I'm actually going to move us into these next few things because you guys hit on them, all of them. So like, to me, like, I look at these storytelling, like storytellers, like there's certain things we can all do. It's like evidently things you want to make audience your biggest fan, and you don't want to make them your enemy. So there's certain things you could say in your banter with them. There's certain things that you may do that may turn people on or off, and so you want to be very conscious of that. We talk about this as we're going already. Use your body language where you can, if on video, and your voice. I always look at all of these things as a performance. That's the thing. If I'm just, and even if it needs to feel like we're just having a conversation, it's always a performance, because you just want to be conscious of that. One thing I like to say is, so when we do have video on, and when we're in person too, is don't draw too much attention away from your story. This would go back into, like, if I had like a really crazy background, like right now I'm in a cabin up in northern Michigan, and I've got the bed my kids are sleeping in right here. So there's nothing too crazy. But if I had like a hot pink background, or like unicorns riding, on the wall behind me, probably part of this conversation you wouldn't have picked up on, because you'd be like, what is that thing on the back of his wall trying to do? I don't understand. So be conscious of your backgrounds too. And I think that, and even what you wear, if you're wearing a hot pink leotard, people might be talking about that versus your storytelling afterwards. Passion and emotion are always going to be your friend. It goes right back into the performance. Part of it is, if you believe it and you convey that in your emotions, we already talked about this earlier, you'll be able to help convey those facts in a way that people will grasp more easily. Because a lot of this is not necessarily making them consume the story, but it's making it easier for them to consume the story. And so passion and emotion, as we know, help to do that. People are connected more to that.
What about,
and then the other
authenticity, Mark?
Oh yeah, go for it.
What about, would that not help people come out with their true authentic self as they're saying that story from a deeper place?
Say that again, Mohammed.
I was just thinking, when you said that, don't memorize your stories, and come from a place of passion and emotion. Yeah. It drew me more towards this idea of coming from a very authentic place, because you're not reading a script, you're not reading a story, but you're coming from your authentic story, your journey, what happened and how it happened and what unfolded.
Oh, dude, you're right on there, because I mean, ultimately for me, if I'm just sitting here and I'm reading a script and I'm just telling you something, you're not going to connect because it's just going to seem kind of fake. And that's actually what I love about like today's session. I've never done anything like this before in terms of the banter back and forth with these sorts of things. But I was like, I know what I'm trying to convey. I know the outcome I want, and so I can get to that through a different means. But the only way that can happen too is if you practice your content and practice and practice. And really what that means here is you have to be able to understand what key elements of your story are needed to convey that universal truth, to get your message across. Because if you just kind of go and riff it as you go and you say, all right, cool, I'm just going to go tell some stories, it's the same thing as trying to play that guitar. I find is, because I've done it before, I can speak to that, is like I say, oh, I'm just going to go wing this right here. And I come in and I'm like, cool, I bring all the emotion, I bring the passion, but I also bring an empty Trojan horse because I didn't have a story constructed in a way that allowed me to get the message across. And I think that's where, to your point, Mohammed, you bring your authentic self because you understand what you're trying to get across and the aspects that are needed to do that.
So I would say my stories aren't always 100% true, because sometimes I don't have an example that will work. But I will have enough of I will have honed it enough that I can get away, so I can do it. And because I do it a lot, I sound authentic. I sound, because it's practiced. But it's not happened to me, but I need them to think it did. Because I need them to buy in.
I will say that is a very dangerous line. It is. I will admit I do the same thing sometimes, and it's one of those things where it becomes how you tell your story will be one of those things where if someone finds out that story is like you conveyed it as something that actually happened to you and then it didn't happen to you really, and they find that out, it is very devastating from a trust perspective. Like especially if you're trying to convey something. So it's like one of those things where actually you'll notice, like I think in some of my appendix slides I actually talk about that. It's like if people see that you are not telling a true story, that can come out. So for me, that's why I always go back to like
maybe why I use fables more. But yeah,
that's exactly what I always say is like if you don't have something that either happened to you or happened to somebody else, you could make up a story and then just kind of put it in the context of like a fable, and be like, there's this, imagine you were the scrum master and you went through this. Like that's a fable right there. That's, it didn't have to be real or anything like that. So yeah, that's a great call out, Alice.
So I've got a question. First off, do you mean that the Three Pigs didn't actually make houses? And then of course, where do you draw that line between the practice and remembering it?
Right, going back to it. I found, I'll be honest, it's going to be by person, and then you're going to find where that lands. So like for me, when I do my stories, sometimes when they're a personal story and I truly understand, like I truly know what it is, I'm usually pretty good. But sometimes when I'm really trying to like there's a hard problem and I have to construct, particularly when I'm dealing with something like an analogy to do it, those are ones that I typically have to practice more because I've got personally less invested in it because it's a new analogy or new fable for me. But then again, it's one of those things where I always like to practice with people too. So like I actually have like fellow Scrum Masters and others who I'll say, hey, I'm trying to get this across. I'm looking to tell this story. Like here, I'm going to tell it to you and let me know how it lands. Like that's something for me in the practice that I use all the time is I talk to other people and say what works, what doesn't.
What I want to notice in the stories, when is the story say over and over, no one cared that you catch the fish is the 2 foot or 3 foot, and every year it's bigger fish. Everyone knows that you catch the big fish, and this is kind of what's happening with the story. If it's little lie, no one will notice, but if you make too colorful.
Oh yeah. Well, it's funny you say that. It kind of goes down to some of these other lines about like either not making yourself out to be a superhero or not making things unrealistic. Because you're right, the bigger the fish is in that case, the more unrealistic it also starts sounding. So if I come in and I tell you I've never had a failure moment with a team, we came across every challenge and we succeeded, many of you will say bullshit, right? Feel like it's like, yes, you came across challenges, and that's actually what we connect to more. Honestly, we as people, we will actually connect more to challenges than we will success stories. And so make your, and then that's why I always say you always want to have that underdog. For me, as I found, I always want to have something that's you're rooting for, but the world may be rooting against. And then that underdog is going against some sort of challenge and then coming out successful at the other side. But sometimes they might not come successful. And that's where, based on the type of story, if you're looking to kind of share some information of like how would I put this? If you're looking to kind of like it's like a warning, of thing, you may share a story that doesn't have a happy ending, and it's mostly you want them to understand that things aren't necessarily always going to work out. And so that's an important thing to invest in, is if they're all happy stories, people will also not necessarily connect, because that doesn't mean they're always going to be something that they can relate to, because not everything's happy.
I think self-deprecation is always handy as well.
Oh yeah, 100%.
I think it's also quite a British thing, but we make yourself.
Oh, we do it pretty good too.
Okay, that's all right. But if your story's got a bit of self-deprecation in it, then people tend to be more on your side.
Well, it's funny you say that too, because like for me, like the top item on this list is slowing down. So for me, slowing down, that is like my number one problem. Like I just like to talk really fast, and like to do these things, and then I come back to at the end of a story, and they're like, cool, you had a lot of energy, but I didn't even understand what you said. And so for me, that's like my biggest thing, is like, okay, the way I think is not as fast as somebody else understands. Cool. I got to keep thinking about that. One of the other ones I'll share, as we kind of wrap this up here, is one of my favorite ones is what we call the power of so to start a story. And the reason is I actually got this out of one of the books that I'll show you here at the end that are some really great reads that you can go through to learn about stories. But this one author talked about this as a transition aspect, because when you start a story with, let me tell you about a time, or once upon a time, it seems very formal. It seems like we're very much getting into like, okay, now Mark is going to tell his stories. But what I like to use, and what this person had brought up, and I really have gravitated to, they say, start your story with so. And the reason is that it feels like you're just continuing a conversation you were already having. So so this one time I was going through blah, 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 blah. Just that little word makes it feel as though we had already been talking. It's not something new. And it's just so subtle, and it's so powerful. So I always say, if you can, leverage that word to kind of make it feel like, Alice, you brought it up. You're like, oh, Alice's story time now. Go through and be like, so there was this one time we were going through, and people might not even pick up that you're telling them a story anymore. They might just say, oh, I've been having a conversation with Alice. Let's see here. Some of the other ones I always have, sometimes stories don't stick. That's okay. This goes back to we get a great story. It's like a hammer with nails. We want to use it everywhere. And even you might have a good story for a specific situation, and you use it, and it was very successful, and you go somewhere else and it's not successful. That goes back to knowing your audience. So just be okay with that, but keep it in your repository. Keep it in your list of things to go back to.
And I think just to add to that, just try and also maybe look at your audience. And, we have this visual, audio, and kinesthetic approaches, and not everybody in the same crowd takes the same message in the same way. So try and mix it up maybe with your content, use good voice and tonality, but then add some visuals behind, but not too distracting away, and add some energy into it. So there's some physical movement, get them to put their hands up and do all of those different things.
Get some movement going on, right? Exactly. Well, it's funny, when I do this talk too, it's a really good connection there. Like when I actually do this talk in person, I actually have these little teeny fake fires I put on all the tables, so that people can kind of feel like they're getting into something. It's not just a talk. It's an experience. So we're going and we're actually going to talk about storytelling around a fire. And it's little things like that I find that as a storyteller I can add to my environment to help people kind of get in and start leaning into the story versus already having them just kind of neutral.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So the last two things I'll talk about. The first one, be vulnerable. This goes back into personal stories, self-deprecation. This is something that is very much can connect people, and that's why that one's so important. Is that we connect to people when we see them as people. So, and many of us in the Agile community, that's our bread and butter right there. We talk about the fact that we got to be real. We've got to talk about like what our lives are really like, not just what we want it to be. And then the last one for me is use stories for good, not evil. And it's funny. The first time one of the first times I gave this talk, I got a lot of people laughing in the audience when I said that, and I was like, yeah, it is kind of funny. But you really do need to think about the ethics of storytelling at some level, because when you look back in history and you look at a lot of the atrocities that have happened, people who you would be like, why would someone ever follow a leader like that? Or why would they do things like that? A lot of times it has to do with the fact that they just have a really good storyteller at the top of that chain, someone who can connect dots that weren't previously connected. They can get the dopamine kicking off because all of a sudden, that makes sense. I can see how that dot connects, because our brains crave that. They want dopamine is the drug is the pleasure drug. We want that. So if I can get somebody who can convince me that right is wrong and wrong is right, I might follow that, not realizing that I've sidestepped my ethics. So it as funny as it sounds, I always say, if you can tell a really good story, it's just like Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. And so you want to think like that and think, how do I want to convey and help people move around obstacles that they're mentally unable to do so. All right, so I'm kind of wrapping up here. Couple things I like to do at the end is leave you with some call to actions. And this actually comes to me as a story that I once heard about a speaker who was at a charity event. And at the end of the charity event, he actually said, all right, folks, I'm going to give you all $10 and I want you to turn it into $100 and donate it back to this charity. And what was really cool about that story is that everyone actually did. Like there was like 100 people in this talk. He gave them all $10, and they all went and they turned it into $100 each. They did it bake sales, they did car washes, they did you name it. They took that $10 and turned it into 100, and then donated it back. And it was such a cool call to action at the end. But I guess I just want to be super clear. I'm not giving you all $10. Okay, let's just be clear about that. But I am going to leave you with two calls to action here. We didn't actually start that story on the daily Scrum, but I want you to go and create that. Take the framework and try it out. See what happens. And if it's not the daily Scrum, try another thing that you're struggling with. Try to leverage that framework and then ultimately share that out. My goal is to not necessarily just propagate that kind of framework. My goal is to make us better storytellers. And so if you come up with alterations or things that you think like, cool, I'm doing it this way and it's making it a better storytelling framework for me, share that with me. I'd love to hear it, because ultimately my goal is, again, my universal truth is not to say, hey, cool, there's this framework out there. My universal truth is that the world becomes better at storytelling. And that kind of all resonates back to this line from one of my favorite authors, Brandon Sanderson. And he says, the purpose of a story is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon. And I think that's where ultimately this is. Story is never going to tell somebody to do something. It's purely going to generate the questions and the emotional response to cause that person to think about those questions in a way that they may not have done in the past. So with that said, that's all I got, Mohammed. Any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for sharing that, Mark. I think for me, I was just, every time I was hearing you speak, I was thinking, how could I relate this to the 4 or 5 key Scrum ceremonies, if you like, because I'm a little bit Scrum heavier in my approach in my teams. And a few things were coming up for me. If I were to take all those different ceremonies or events or whatever Scrum calls them today, I was thinking, well, how could a backlog refinement, and I know that's not a Scrum event formally, but how could I look at a backlog refinement session as a story? And I thought, well, isn't a backlog just a journey from A to B, highest priority to lowest priority from A to B? And I thought, well, if we were to look at our backlog as a journey, then we could cut little stories out of it, which are essentially the sprint planning goals. The goal you create are your 2-week, 1-week, 3-week sprints. If you can create the goals, you can create a story around the goals, right? And the story is that we will make this difference to this person by the end of the 2 weeks, or this persona will make a difference or add this capability to the system. But then that started really going deeper for me, because everyone else mentioned things like, you know, metaphors, Titanic, and all these different examples that we used. And then it took me back to something that Helen Meek had said once in a session she ran here at Agile North Ants, which was metaphors for retrospectives. And you know how we use boats or speedboats or parachutes and all of these different metaphors to improve teams and use as retrospective tools? Well, it just dawned on me that those are stories in their own right.
They are,
When
right?
somebody
Those
jumps
are
off the
all,
plane.
because when you tell that, you think about that when you tell about the speedboat or the hot air balloon. When you do that, you have to explain it. When you explain it in the form of a story. You explain it in like the hot air that rises us up. And you think about that. You're getting the details, everything. The anchor that's pulling us down. Again, that's something I can visually and emotionally connect to.
Yeah,
I love
absolutely. And I was just thinking, you know, wow, everything you've said today is very tightly linked to all of these key events that we do. And then I got stuck a little bit in the daily stand-up, and I thought, how can we gamify or make storytelling a feature in the daily stand-up, right? And we always talk about yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But I began to wonder what stops us as a group to just add a few questions or remove a question to create a story behind it. So I was thinking something like, let's say you knew your team and your team were, you know, into football, and you know there was a bit of a rivalry between the team within the team. So let's say one supported Man United, for those of you that are in the UK, and another one supporting Liverpool. If that's the case, and if there's a big thing going on, that's a theme or happening in the world, or there's a Premier League game going on or something, could you bring a football in and kick that around to pick the next person in the daily stand-up instead of going round? And could we ask people more stories? Like I tried this the other day, which was really interesting, which was instead of just those 3 questions, I said, guys, we've got 10 more minutes in the daily stand-up, we're done. Maybe I ask you one question, and the question I asked was, what's one thing you did yesterday that you feel really proud about? So whilst it's not quite story related, what it does is it engages that, hey, you know what? When I compiled that code,
it engages here, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And then, you know, other people become aware of the fact that you were proud that you delivered something that compiled, that you know, did what it needed to do. And so on the whole, I ended up realizing after this session that storytelling can be used wholly, but not just that, but it's ripe for things like demos and reviews.
One of the things that, oh, go for it, sorry.
Just to finish one quickly. I remember one guy, for those of you who have worked at RS Components during the time when I was there, there was a product owner we had named Teslin, and we were developing a mobile product and a mobile application. And it was for a persona of the engineers that are working offsite that need to order certain products from that thing. And they're offsite, their internet connection isn't good. So what he did, very interestingly, is he went out, he bought himself a high-vis jacket, a hard hat, boots, a belt for tools, and a whole bunch of stuff. And he came in prepared like that persona, that engineer. And he came in, he gave a demo by role-playing. And then he realized he's got a hammer, he's got a Stanley knife, he's got all of these funky tools, but the only tool he needs is the mobile phone. And he opened the app that we developed and he showed it on the screen to everybody in terms of how it solved his need. So, you know, it got me thinking.
And that right there is a story, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And he was like, oh, that's not working. He pretended to make some phone calls and this and that. And he created a whole scene around it. And, you know, a lot of stuff, it takes a lot of thought to do all of that. And I'm not sure how much time the agile world invests, which is why I think this particular session is quite powerful. To be able to
I think one thing I'll say is I know a lot of people are having to drop and because it's the end of the session, but the thing I guess I'll leave with this too is that idea that story for us is not a tool we have in our toolbox. It kind of is our toolbox. It's how we communicate, it's how we talk, and it's things like different facilitation techniques. It's things like our knowledge on Scrum and Agile and these concepts that are actually the tools we put into that toolbox. And it's our ability to tell stories and weave those things together that allows us to help teams move to a new, move in a new direction. And so as you think about this, your role here is not a Scrum Master, a business analyst, a product owner, what have you. Your actual job is master storyteller, and you're going to use the things in your toolbox, your knowledge on these areas, to actually help move your teams forward, move your product forward in ways that they haven't before. And it's a subtle mindset shift, but if you think about your world in the form that you are a storyteller, you're going to see things from a different light that's going to cause you to ask questions in a different way, talk about things in a different way. So that'll be kind of where I'll leave it there.
Can I just say though, from what Mohammed said, where he asked people what he did the best thing they're most proud of yesterday, you weren't then a storyteller, you were a story collector. You were asking them.
That's a good way of thinking about that.
You were asking them to share their stories with you, and you were collecting their stories.
Indeed.
So.
And that's a really great way of thinking about that too, Alice, where it's like as you go in and you ask people to share theirs, that then gives you the ability to, again, catalog new stories that you could potentially tell, or tell them back to the team later. Like at the end of the sprint, you can tell them about, it's like, hey, I remember this really good story that Alice once told us, about XYZ. All of a sudden you have a character that people can relate to, that people can connect to, and they might be able to bring that back to a point where they're like, it gets them over a hill that they're going through, because they're like, oh wow, we did go through that. Alice went through that, and this is what she did. That's awesome.